Over the past 4 years, Monza has had the likes of Charles Leclerc winning in his first season at Ferrari in 2019. 2020 had Pierre Gasly winning Monza with Lance Stroll on the podium, and in 2021 we had Daniel Ricciardo getting McLaren's first win in over 9 years and their first 1-2 finish since the 2010 Canadian Grand Prix. So excluding last year where we had Max Verstappen's absolute dominance, Monza in recent years has somehow led to unexpected results. So starting in 2019, you might think Leclerc's win wasn't actually that unlikely, and it is probably one of the more likely ones we're going to talk about, but this was his first season at Ferrari. He had just been promoted from Sauber, but this is Leclerc's second win in Formula 1, and his only previous win before this came in Spa at the previous race. So why does Monza produce some unlikely winners? Well, the Ferraris were fighting the Mercedes in that race, and Bottas came out after the race and he said that when he was behind that Ferrari, they could only match their speed when he had his DRS open. Bottas also said that the Ferrari engine was far superior to what the Mercedes had on that race weekend, and the turbulence coming off the back of the car was a major problem for him when trying to overtake. So we know Monza is a low downforce circuit and the least downforce on the calendar. It's basically a drag race with a few corners chucked in, but teams will actually produce a new rear wing just for Monza. It'll be their Monza rear wing, and they won't take it to any other circuits just to try reduce the drag around that track. Now also in 2019 we had the older cars which gave off massive wakes and chucked off a lot of dirty air straight back, unlike the newer cars these days which chuck the dirty air more upwards. So when these older cars were going around the Parabolica, they could go around this corner in 6th gear and up to 142 miles per hour. Now when you're running a car with such little downforce as they are, and you've got the dirty air from the car ahead, it's extremely difficult to follow closely. We've seen many drivers crash out at the Parabolica on this corner, especially Leclerc in 2020, the following year. Now talking of this, it brings up the Monza curse. Now this is Leclerc won in 2019 and he crashed out in 2020. Pierre Gasly won in 2020 and he DNF'd in 2021. Daniel Ricciardo won in 2021 and DNF'd in 2022. So it's not looking good for Max Verstappen this season. The next driver that had an unlikely win was Pierre Gasly. Now Gasly actually won that race from P10, and it's not like that AlphaTauri was hugely competitive that season. It was a lot more competitive than it was in 2022. It definitely wasn't one of the quickest cars on the grid. And Gasly actually hit another car going into turn 1 on lap 1. It was the Red Bull. He managed to avoid damage for the rest of the race. Now Gasly won this race by strategy mainly. Obviously he had a great drive, but without the strategy he definitely wouldn't have won this race. He pitted as normal, and as soon as he came out the pits, Magnussen pulled over and a safety car came out, which from a strategy perspective is probably the worst thing you can have happen. You obviously want to pit under safety car conditions because you save a huge amount of time by all the other cars driving a lot slower. Now somehow this actually managed to pay off for Gasly. Hamilton pitted during the safety car, but the pit lane was actually closed and there was red flags which he didn't see, so him and a few other drivers actually ended up getting a penalty. Now with the pit lane opening the next lap, all the drivers flooded into the pit lane to put on a new set of tyres, but the safety car was actually coming in that following lap. So the drivers pitted under safety car conditions, which saved time, but they didn't actually have time to catch up to the safety car. So taking into account penalties and pit stops, Gasly in this position was a net P1. With Hamilton's penalty and Lance Stroll pitting for a new set of tyres, Gasly managed to get the win. But he was still holding off quite a few drivers for 20 to 30 odd laps. And that brings us on to the second point on why it's so hard to overtake around Monza, and it's just due to the minimal impact that DRS has on that rear wing. Now if you think how much drag a rear wing is producing around a track like Hungary or Monaco, it is pushing that car into the ground a huge amount. So when that rear wing opens and the DRS is activated, you lose a huge amount of downforce, and in return you get a lot more top speed. Now in Monza you want to reduce as much downforce from that rear wing as possible really, so when that DRS opens you're not actually seeing much benefit, and a lot of drivers have said that having DRS around Monza is almost non-existent. So with the car in front getting clean air and getting a lot of cool air for their brakes, it's actually quite a favourable position, unlike some other tracks where it's good to sit behind another car and get the slipstream. Moving on to the most recent driver that had an unexpected win, and that was Daniel Ricciardo. Now Ricciardo only qualified in P5, but this was the new season with the new sprint format. and with a really strong performance in the sprint quali, he actually managed to finish that in P3, which obviously translated to the Sunday grid. Now Bottas, who was in front of him, had to take an engine penalty, so this resulted in Daniel Ricciardo starting on the front row. He had a great start and managed to lead after the first chicane. Now with Daniel Ricciardo leading and Hamilton and Verstappen behind them bumping into each other and fighting, this led him to take the lead fairly easily. And then we obviously had where Hamilton comes out of the pits to match Verstappen almost perfectly, like it had been written by a script. Verstappen goes over the sausage curb, which sort of projected his car on top of Hamilton's and puts them both out of the race. Now from lap 32, Ricciardo was in the lead and he managed to keep that position until the end and win the race. Now the third reason why Monza does have so many surprising winners is it is surprisingly difficult to overtake. The track is quite narrow and it doesn't really have any runoff areas like some other tracks do, like Paul Ricard for example. This makes any overtake extremely risky and actually quite difficult, as there's no room for error and drivers may be a little bit reserved and wait for better opportunities for overtakes. Monza has grass at the edge of the tarmac, like straight away. There's no runoff or tarmac between, and as we know, grass is not an ideal surface for Formula 1 cars. We just have to see George Russell trying to overtake Bottas around Imola to know that putting your car on the grass is not a good idea. Now obviously Leclerc, Gasly and Ricciardo's wins wouldn't have happened without external factors like safety cars, red flags, other drivers crashing that were ahead of them. But these things in Formula 1 are fairly common and they're not exclusive to Monza. It does seem like a track where the slower cars can hold off the faster cars down the straight and then they can defend in the corners, as all the braking zones are extremely heavy. Now obviously this is just in recent years, and if you look back over the past 30 years you'll recognise most of the names. So we'll keep an eye on 2023 if we get any new expected winners around Monza, and Max Verstappen will need to keep an eye out for that Monza curse.